Hi, Denise Gwen, reading aloud for you from my novel, His Christmas Eve Proposal, Book 3 of The Medicine Women of Alaska, Chapter 24. In the past, Drew wouldn't have hesitated to dive right in and start taking care of the patient. But he knew that the patient was in far better hands with Naomi. And so, instead of forcing himself into the life-saving portion of this journey, he focused on the other rescue aspect of this mission, getting the man ready to be mobilized and medevaced off this mountain in a hurry. Once the boulders, small rocks, and debris were pulled from his chest, the patient was going to bleed to death if they didn't work quickly. He had to be ready for it. He glanced over at Naomi, then looked at her again, more fully this time. Usually she jumped right in and started working, but to his surprise, she kneeled in front of the patient, staring in shock at the man beneath her hands. This was so unlike her. She appeared totally discombobulated. And then he recalled another moment when she'd behaved oddly, down at the makeshift hospital with her first patient. She'd been distracted, and had taken a good long while after the woman got evacuated before she focused on her next patient. This wasn't the Naomi he knew. "Paul," she said in a strangled voice, "has a medevac been ordered?" "We can't," Paul said. "The chopper blades might set off another avalanche." "Crap," Drew muttered. "That's right." "It's a 10-minute hike up this mountain," she said tersely. "I know that, Dr. Schuster, but once we get him stabilized and on a gurney, we can get him out of the slide zone and then hook him to a hoist and get him off the trail that way." "He's bleeding internally." Her features had gone pale. "I can't let him die." "We're not going to let him die, Naomi," Drew said gently. "Even as I speak, there's a team racing up the mountain, and they'll carry him out of here into a safe, clear spot where a chopper can land and hoist him out of here." He stared at her, harder than he wanted, but hard enough to get the point through. "Right now, you need to focus on your triage." He was speaking harshly at her. He felt bad for this, but he had to get through to her. Naomi nodded, pulled her stethoscope out of her medical kit, and he relaxed internally as he watched her focus on the ABCs of emergency care: airway, breathing, and consciousness. She bent low over the man's chest and listened. It probably wasn't very encouraging, what she could hear. "He's got a definite crush injury," she said. "You're right, Dr. Rutherford. I'll have to insert a chest tube." Paul nodded. "Get it in, and once you start it draining, we can move these boulders off his body." "Was he awake when you first came upon him, Paul?" Drew asked. "Did you get his name?" Naomi, who'd been pulling the chest tube from her medical bag, glanced up sharply. Paul snorted with derision. Drew, he's probably the most famous man you'll ever help get off a mountain." Naomi looked at him. Drew shook his head. "What?" "That's Ricardo Velasquez, one of the richest men in all of Los Angeles and the most eligible bachelor in the lower 49. "Not anymore," Naomi said shortly. "Not the richest man in all of Los Angeles?" Paul asked. "No, the other one," she said. Drew wondered at the tone in her voice. Anger? Bitterness? Paul's eyes widened. "He's married?" "Yep." Her blue eyes cleared. "I'm going to insert the chest tube, so be ready in case he wakes up and starts screaming." "I'm ready," Drew said, and went to the man's head to hold him steady. If he awoke and started screaming, he'd set off a second avalanche and it'd bury them. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," Drew said. As Naomi inserted the tube, Ricardo awoke and started howling in agony. Drew held the man's head in place, and Paul clutched the man's one free arm as Naomi twisted the tube and finally pushed it into place in the intercostal space. She taped it down, and the man kept screaming, but his screams lessened, grew muted. Bright red blood drained from his chest. "Let's get him out of here, stat," she said. She jumped to her feet, and Paul helped her to dislodge the gigantic boulder that trapped the man upon the ground. "Am I dying?" the man asked, terrified. "No," Drew said calmly. "There was an avalanche, and we're getting you out of here as quickly as possible." Then the most astonishing thing happened. The man's eyes opened. He saw Naomi. His eyes widened, first in surprise, then shock, before he turned away. His eyes glazed over into unconsciousness. Naomi bent down and opened one eyelid to check his pupillary response. "Oh, dear God, we've got to get him out of here." At that moment, paramedics rounded the bend bearing a stretcher. Drew craned his ears and heard the oh-so-familiar whirring of helicopter blades. Thank goodness someone had deemed it safe enough to send the medevac up here. A thick cable dropped down from the chopper. The paramedics lifted the patient onto a gurney, slid the gurney onto the cage floor, hooked the stretcher to the cables, and secured the patient in the cage. At the last moment, Paul jumped up and into the cage and leaned in next to the patient as the chopper lifted up from the site and flew away. "Just like the Army," Paul called down to them, smiling, as the chopper bore him and Ricardo Velasquez away. Drew smiled briefly as he watched his brother, then turned his attention to Naomi. She looked frightened and upset. He walked over to her. "Are you okay?" "No," she said, "I'm not." But she didn't offer any statements. She pressed her lips together, turned her back on him, and walked down the mountainside.